One thing no one ever taught me when I became a father was how to react to my own kid talking about his old life. No, he wasn't adopted, he wasn't an orphan. My wife gave birth to him and we've had him his entire life, but he seems to remember differently. From the moment my son Claude, named after my grandfather, started showing interest in things, he seemed to be drawn to lighthouses. We had a nautical theme in his room for a while, and we just assumed it was because of that. His walls were a dark blue with one wall of wallpaper that had a scenic view with the lighthouse. His mobile over his bed had a lighthouse, a boat, a helm, and other similarly themed items. We just thought it was cute that he seemed really fascinated by it and clung to it. The way he watched the mobile move was like he was in pure awe of it all, and as he got older, he seemed to just stare at the wallpaper. His fascination really grew when he was able to talk, draw, and articulate more. Any type of blocks he played with, he always built a tall tower and he would put one of his little people at the top of it. He loved playing what he called boats and watchers. He did his best drawing lighthouses too, and even made a yellow circle around it, trying to indicate the light that circled. When he could talk more, he asked for more books about lighthouses. It was like any other child's obsession with dinosaurs or superheroes. His was just lighthouses. We found a few kids' books for him that were about the lighthouses, but he wanted more. That kid doesn't have a mean bone in his body, but I could tell that he was expecting something different with the books. So we took him to the library so he could pick out his own. To my surprise, he went to basically an encyclopedia about lighthouses. A book that explained how they worked, listed different ones, the structure, and how long they've been in use. Not what I was expecting a kid to be interested in. He picked it out and immediately began flipping through the pages. I thought we would get home and he would just forget about the book, but surprisingly, he was sitting on his bedroom floor flipping through the pages and talking to himself about the different ones. He was mumbling things like, "No, not that one. Kind of, but it was all gray. No, the windows weren't like that." It was such a strange but interesting thing. I'm a school teacher and my wife is an accountant. Neither of us have any particular interest in maritime history, and we live in Ohio, hundreds of miles from the ocean, so we never understood where this fixation came from. The only thing we would correlate it to was his bedroom theme, and we wondered, could we really have accidentally influenced him that much with it? But we learned there was more to it, more than what he would say to us. When we took our first real family vacation together, we were talking about going to a theme park of sorts, such as Universal Studios, and we asked him what he would prefer. To our surprise, even still, he didn't want to go to any of those. He asked to go see a real lighthouse. We wanted the trip to be memorable for him, and we felt going somewhere he didn't want or somewhere he wasn't interested in was not a good impression. So we changed our plans entirely to spend a week-long trip on the New England coast. While up there, we visited 2 different ones and even went to a museum about them. Claude loved it. He seemed very focused on what the people were saying in the museum and the lighthouses, and asking a lot of questions. But I still didn't understand his enthusiasm. I was absolutely willing to support it. But then we were passing one in Maine that changed everything. It wasn't one of the famous ones, just a modest lighthouse on a rocky outcropping near a tiny coastal town. We weren't actually planning on stopping at it since there weren't any signs for it or anything, but Claude was insistent that we go. Similar to what I mentioned before, he's typically an easygoing kid, and typically pretty calm. But that morning he was adamant. He wasn't asking as he normally did. It was more so, we have to go there. I need to see it. It's important. The way he stressed this told my wife and I that we should stop. As we drove down the narrow coastal road, Claude seemed to become more and more eager to get out of the car. He was reaching up, trying to look out the window more, and constantly looking around the area. And as we drove, he said very matter-of-factly that the lighthouse entrance was to the right. We curved around the road, and there it was. The entrance directly to the right of the bend. There was no way to know that from where we were. We parked, and as my wife was unbuckling him, he mumbled, "I remember this one." She asked him to clarify, and he ignored her, and just began walking toward the lighthouse, which is when she told me what she heard. Once we reached the lighthouse, Claude put his hand on the gray stone and smiled, looking toward the top. His eyes looked watery like he was about to cry. My wife asked him what was wrong, and all he said was, "I lived here a long time ago when I was grown up." My wife and I looked at each other, not really considering what he said at the time. I know at first I thought that he was just playing around like he did at home. Maybe this one he saw in one of his books and he liked it more than the others. But the way he said it, with that certainty, it gave me the chills. There was a man right inside giving information and a tour of the lighthouse, sharing some of the history of said lighthouse. As the man went through his normal information, Claude would respond with certain affirmations confirming what the man said was correct. Towards the top, as he continued talking, Claude touched part of the wall that looked slightly off. The man started explaining how lighthouses get damaged and examples of damage, but Claude shook his head, telling him that he was incorrect. He explained how that part of the lighthouse was damaged specifically and then said, "I had to fix it myself because nobody could get out here for weeks." The man chuckled and made a joke about how many times the lighthouse keepers may be left alone for weeks or months due to storms, so it was possible. He asked my son if he knew who took care of this one, and Claude didn't hesitate. "I did, Charlie." My wife and I looked down at him confused. His name was Claude, and his middle and last name were not even close to Charlie. So where did this come from? But even more shocking, the man said that he was correct, that Charles was the keeper from 1872 to 1891. I asked Claude if he had read about this lighthouse in his book, and he said no, that he couldn't find it. The man nodded and said that this was not a common lighthouse. It was smaller than normal and so run down that it's not one that's portrayed in books or movies. He said that you only really knew of this one if you lived in the area or were part of the family that owned it. But he did talk a bit more about Charles, saying he was one of the longest-serving lighthouse keepers, and then Claude started asking more questions about the lighthouse and the surrounding area. He asked about the vegetable garden south of the property, and about a particular type of lens that had been used in the 1880s. The guide was visibly impressed by his knowledge and kept asking how he knew these things. The hair on my arm stood up because I had no explanation to offer either. From there, the man guided us to a small building near the lighthouse that had been turned into a small museum on one side and a general store on the other. There were a few glass displays with some of Charles' personal belongings, including a pocket watch, an old warped logbook, and what looked like an old daguerreotype photograph of a man I presumed to be Charles. Claude pressed his face against the glass and smiled. He looked up at us and said, "Yep, that's me. That was me." He pointed at the photo and then pulled his arm back, rubbing his left one. He said that the scar on Charles' left hand was from an accident. As he put it, "I got that when I was fixing the lantern during a storm. The glass broke and cut me really bad." My wife nudged me at that point, and I knew why. Claude actually has a birthmark on his left hand, nearly identical to Charles's scar from that picture. Walking away from the displays, there were small trinkets and gifts that you could purchase. Claude picked up a small book that was more informational about the town we were in than anything. It had a small section in it about Charles, too. He also grabbed a pamphlet about the town and the lighthouses in the area. And then he picked out a small notebook that was made to look similar to the logbook that we saw in the display case. Claude then asked if he could get those items. While they weren't exactly something a child would normally pick out, the way he asked was very childlike. It was the first childlike thing he had said since we arrived. And because of the bizarre experience we all just witnessed, I couldn't say no. We approached the register and the woman looked just as amused by his selection. He explained to her that he was Charles and he wanted something to remember him by. We got to talking while she checked us out. She even gave us the book for free. And we learned that the man at the lighthouse was her husband, and that Charles was actually her great-great-great-uncle or something like that. The way Claude's face lit up to this was incredible. At that moment, he looked like a very happy and proud parent, as he listened to her go on about her family history and how she opened the shop as a way to honor his memory and pay the bills. Before we left, Claude asked if he could hug the woman and she agreed. He hugged her like he knew her his whole life, like he'd been on this earth a lot longer than 10 years. Afterwards, we left, and I don't think anything could have wiped the smile off of his face. As we left, my wife and I were at a loss for words, not knowing how to react to this new information. But Claude seemed different. He was calmer, peaceful. He thanked us for stopping by there and said, "I'm glad we came here. I think I needed to see it again to make sure I remembered." When we got back to the hotel, I asked Claude if he wanted to talk about it, and he sure did. He told us a few crazy stories about being on the water, how he was married but they never had children. He even told us about the storm that took his life, but the whole time he seemed to be in amazement as he recalled these past memories. Then, the rest of our trip, it was back to normal. Nothing could dampen his joy. He loved everywhere else we went and thanked us profusely for the trip. Once we got back home, he read that book multiple times. He wrote in the logbook Charles's name, date of birth and death, and where he was born. And that was it. He kept both on his shelf in his room, and after a year or so, he stopped talking about Charles. He still loved lighthouses, but it wasn't nearly as obsessive. Thinking back on this event today, nearly a decade later, I'm still in awe. Neither my wife nor myself ever thought about reincarnation. We never really talked about our thoughts or beliefs on it because we aren't really religious. But this really made us think more about it. We wanted to be completely supportive of him, but based on everything I've read, most kids who have similar memories, they tend to fade and forget about it, especially after getting some kind of closure. But even though he doesn't talk about it anymore, he still has an appreciation for lighthouses, and he has kept that logbook ever since. Hi, Raven. There is a weight on my shoulders. A weight that I've been carrying for a long time. I'm going to tell you and your audience my story so that I may share my experience with a sympathetic ear, and in doing so, perhaps I'll finally be able to forgive myself and move on. So let me begin. I awoke in the dark, unable to see anything. I wasn't sure where I was or how I got there, but I was alone with only my thoughts to keep me company. Do not forget, I said to myself. Do not forget. I was holding on to a memory, something that was very important to me, and somehow I felt that this was the reason I had ended up in this situation. Do not forget, I said to myself. as images of that memory filled my mind and filled the darkness in which I found myself. Whatever had happened to me prior had put me into some kind of holding pattern, and now all I knew was the darkness, the memory, and those 3 words, "do not forget." How long had I been here? How much longer must I keep this up? I wasn't sure. Then, something distracted me. Something that hit my senses through the darkness, a change in temperature, a sound, a feeling of warmth. No, don't be distracted. This is too important. Do not forget, I said to myself once more. And once again, I went into a trance-like state, with just myself, the darkness, and the images of that memory. But this time the images were gone. So complete and so sudden was my amnesia that I wouldn't have even realized it had happened, if it were not for those 3 words that I was still repeating to myself. Do not forget. Those 3 words had been my mantra. My mission, my reason for being had suddenly become a source of anxiety, of worry, and of painful realization that I had forgotten. I had failed. I would have cried. I would have screamed, but I couldn't. Instead, I began to choke. I couldn't breathe. And that's when I realized where I was. I was in a pool of water and I was drowning. Desperate for air, desperate to escape. Was this how I die? And then with a flash, I was surrounded by light. Cold, harsh, unforgiving light. This is the story of the first memory that I can recall. For a time, I thought I must have invented it, but eventually I came to realize that this is the story of my birth. The sense of failure that I experienced in the womb was so emotionally devastating that it induced my mother, and as a result, I was born 5 weeks premature. I have no idea what I was trying to remember. Sometimes it feels like it's almost coming back to me, but then once again, it's gone. I'm really not sure what I should do. Should I get a past life regression, or should I let it go? Perhaps we're not supposed to remember these things for a reason. And what if I had managed to hold on to that memory for just 5 more weeks? Would life be different now? I really don't know. This story isn't actually about me, but about my younger sister Sherry. Ever since we learned more and she shared more of her experiences, I've been fascinated by the idea of past life stories. Listening to similar stories on YouTube, it finally kicked me into gear to write up my sister's story to share. With her permission, of course. Growing up, Sherry was always different from the rest of our musically challenged family. Where I couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, she had an immediate and unexplained affinity for music the moment she could reach a keyboard. No one in my family were musicians. My parents got me a cheap used clarinet when I wanted to try out band class, but I was terrible at it. My sister wanted to do the same, but she was still in grade school and they didn't offer band at that point, beyond recorders and triangles. That didn't stop my sister from having a complete meltdown in a department store when my mother tried to pull her away from a display keyboard. My mom tried to tell her when she was closer to my age that she could try an instrument, but I'll never forget my sister's explanation as to why she wanted to play so badly, and why the keyboard. In the store, she looked down at her hands and said in the saddest voice, "My hands need to play." So, for her birthday that year, my parents bought her a small keyboard, thinking it would be abandoned like most children's gifts, that she would play around with it for a few months and then never touch it again. But instead, Sherry began playing that thing like she's known how to for years. She placed it on the coffee table, sat in front of it, and after pressing a few keys, she placed her hands on it gently and started playing it. She didn't play a simple nursery rhyme either. Instead, she played these complex-sounding songs that were beyond what a child her age should be capable of playing. I remember my parents both being impressed looking at each other, like, how does she know how to do that? And then asking her about it. Sherry again would just look down at her hands and say they remembered how to do it. None of us understood, so my parents said that she must just be naturally good at it and let it go. Sherry played that thing constantly, and by the age of 8, my parents wanted to look at finding her a piano teacher trying to hone in on this unique skill that none of us seemed to have. My mom had a friend who used to be a music teacher, so she asked her about it. Now, this is coming from what I was told by my sister and my mom because I wasn't there. But my mom told us how her friend was reluctant to teach Sherry because of how young she was. She said kids that age usually have trouble focusing on something such as music that long, or they're unable to move their hands and fingers fast enough to keep up with or reach the notes. But then after their first meeting, she asked my mom if she was seeing someone else or watching instructional videos. When my mom told her no, she explained her amazement. She told her that Sherry had a technique of someone who had been playing for decades. Sherry continued getting lessons from my mom's friend for a few years after that, progressing rapidly and showing a particular affinity for romantic-era compositions. I remember watching her play at this contest at the age of 12, and she seemed to enter an almost trance-like state, often closing her eyes and swaying to the music. Her skills seemed completely unexplainable, but we were all proud of her and certainly impressed. The only thing she ever mentioned to us about it was remembering how to play, but none of us knew what she meant by that. But fast forward in time here to 2012, and we're both adults. Sherry is 28, and I'm 32. We both have our own lives and different careers. She became a music teacher, and I work in marketing. Yes, long abandoning any love I had for music. Sherry never pursued a concert pianist path or anything like that, but she said that she loved her job and that it was quite fulfilling for her. For the most part, that is. She would tell me on occasion that something was missing from her relationship with music, but she could never figure out what. Then she called me in spring of 2012 and asked me about taking a vacation with her. I was up to the idea, thinking we would go to our normal destinations, but I was surprised to hear her say that she wanted to go to Vienna. I had traveled out of the country before, that wasn't a big deal, but I had never been to Vienna, and she had never left the country. To my surprise, she had already gotten her passport and everything that she needed. She was really just counting on me to agree with it. I was hesitant at first, but when I asked why Vienna, it was her response that really told me I should go. She said, "I really need to do this, and you're the only person I trust enough to do this with me." Then she went on to explain how she'd been having these dreams about a yellow building and music she had never played before. She said in her dream, she saw a road sign indicating that it was in Vienna. She said, "I think something will be there for me to help explain everything." It was just cryptic enough, and the concern in her voice was just enough to make me leap at the opportunity. After a bit more planning and rescheduling some things, we got the trip planned and set up. We had a pretty shaky itinerary, but honestly, I was okay with just being there with her. Sherry and I had always been close, and we hadn't been able to have a vacation like that in a few years. So when we got to our hotel, Sherry completely abandoned what we had planned and wanted to just explore. A little odd, but again, I was okay with it. We went to a festival that was being held the following night. We went to a few local cafes and tried some new things, and I couldn't help but notice how happy Sherry seemed to be. She seemed to love the atmosphere, everywhere we went. It was like she had been there before and was soaking in being back there again. Then, on our third day there, we were walking around a new area, exploring the shops, when Sherry suddenly stopped walking. She was staring down a narrow side street with such intensity. I thought maybe she saw someone there and that we needed to get out of the area. Instead, she said that we needed to go there and pointed to an older-looking yellow building. I tried asking her why, but she refused to say and just begged me to follow her, so I did. The house turned out to be a small museum dedicated to music. As we entered, Sherry moved through the exhibits like she knew exactly where she was. She led me to a glass display that contained a few personal items that belonged to this pianist. I had never heard of her, and not that I had a lot of knowledge in older composers, but Sherry on the other end seemed to be connected. The plaque explained how this person was a promising concert pianist during the 1830s and 1840s, but she wasn't famous by any means. The display included her gloves, some sheets of music with handwritten notations, and several letters. Sherry put her hands over the glass where the gloves were, and she said her hands hurt her a lot. I tried asking what she meant by that when an older woman approached us. Based on the way she was dressed and the name tag, she clearly worked there. She asked us if we knew who the pianist was, and when I shook my head, Sherry said that she thinks she does. The woman said she heard Sherry's comments about her hands, which is why she asked. Because based on the information they had on her and what they found in her diaries and records, the pianist suffered from what we now believe was rheumatoid arthritis. She explained how it ended her performing career, which she documented in her personal diaries. Those diaries weren't in public display either, so how could Sherry have known? The woman then led us through the rest of the displays, telling us more about this pianist. When we reached a room that had been set up to recreate a 19th century music salon, complete with the piano, I remember seeing how Sherry's face lit up to see it too. She asked if she could play it, and the woman was hesitant at first. She explained how it wasn't normally allowed, but she pointed at Sherry smiling and said that she seemed special, and asked her if she knew how to play. After Sherry explained her musical career, the woman agreed to let her play for a few minutes and guided her to the piano. I will never forget how she sat at the piano, took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and then began playing this hauntingly beautiful piece that I didn't recognize. I had heard plenty of pieces as she played them at home or during shows and contests. This one, I had never heard her play before. I studied the woman's face to get a read from her, and I watched her go from one of concern and confusion to shock and impressed as she smiled at my sister. When Sherry finished, the woman asked where she had learned that song. Sherry told her that she thinks it was the pianist from the display, and I can't make this up. They spoke at the same time. Sherry said memories of home, where the woman said something in German and then smiled because it meant the same thing. Without making eye contact with us, Sherry revealed that she thinks that she was the pianist in another life. She explained her dream more and how she pictured the countryside where she grew up. She explained how her hands would hurt so much, and how it was painful to her knowing that she would have to stop playing. All the woman could say was that the song Sherry had just played exists only in manuscripts in their archive, but were never recorded or performed publicly. She told us that if Sherry knew this, then what she was saying had to be true. That the same pianist wanted another chance at sharing her love for music. She had just accepted Sherry's confession like she had heard similar stories before. I was speechless. How long had my sister felt this way? Did she know this as a child growing up? And was this why she was so good at playing? Is this even possible? I mean, how else would she have known the song? The woman showed us some other items they had of the pianist that weren't on display, and we both stood in awe when Sherry remembered some of the items. After some time, and we had seen and talked about all we could, The woman gave us a list of places to visit that had connections to the pianist. She then took Sherry's hands into her own and welcomed her back home before we left. For the rest of our trip, we visited the places the woman gave us, including an old apartment building where she had lived, a small church where she had performed, and even a park that offered the view that the pianist described in her letters. That same view was one that Sherry had dreamt about, that she had explained in detail to the woman and I. When we returned home, we had a family dinner where we talked about our trip, and Sherry actually brought up her experiences and how she believes they were connected to her abilities to play the piano. Except, my parents didn't talk about things like reincarnation. They weren't religious, but they also were skeptical about things like past lives and the supernatural. My dad claimed there was an explained reason for it all, but privately, my mom confessed that she can't explain what happened to us in Vienna. She's more willing to consider the alternative explanations, I think, but she chooses her words carefully when the subject comes up. Since our trip, Sherry has really embraced her past life recollections. She plays that pianist's piece occasionally, and I've even watched her play pieces and write it down trying to reconstruct it. She's never played it in a concert, as she says, out of respect to her. She said that she wants to honor her life, but that she doesn't feel like playing the piece as Sherry would be the right thing to do. So, she just plays it for me and plays it for herself. As for me, I don't have any other explanation, nor do I have any reason to not believe her. Watching my sister's fingers move across the piano keys, especially as a 7-year-old, playing music that by all means should have been lost to history, makes it pretty impossible to dismiss the idea that somehow, across nearly 2 centuries, that pianist's musical memory has found its way back through Sherry's hands. And, until there is another solid explanation, I'm there 100% to support my sister. So that, my friends, was a collection of some past life stories. The 10th collection on this channel, I do believe. That's what I wrote down in my notes. So if it's not, then I wrote the notes wrong. So, anyways, past life stories are always interesting. Always, mentally, this is probably going to not be the right way I want to say this, but always mentally compelling stories that just make me really, interested. They grip the old brain sack and won't let go, if that makes sense. It doesn't, but just humor me and say it does. Anyways, I enjoy these stories, and hopefully you all enjoyed them as well. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button, the like button on the video. If you're new to the channel and liked what you heard, consider subscribing. And if you're feeling bold, consider leaving me a comment with your thoughts on anything. The video, me, yourself, question mark? Or what your favorite internet browser is. I don't really have a favorite. I use both Firefox and Chrome, depending on what the task is, so. Anyways. You can also join Patreon and memberships, get early access to content like this, listen to the podcast on other platforms such as Spotify, Pandora, and Audible. You can also check out my book on Amazon. Just search for The Insomniac's Experiment by Raven Adams. It's on there. You can email me if you're interested in a copy of the book that's signed. You can super thanks, which is a tip to the channel. Super chat whenever I do my live streams on Saturday, which I will be doing on Saturday, which will be yesterday from the time this video goes live at 6 p.m. Central. And yeah. Send your stories into astheravendreams.com. That's the other thing you can do. Anyways, hope you all have a beautiful weekend. Had a beautiful weekend. Hope you all have a beautiful week, and hope I see you again here very soon. But until then, remember, you are loved, you are valid, you are important. You are the bestie that you can be. Do not forget it, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Until next time, my friends, much love, and sleep well.